Welcome to another edition of the Hawk Off the Press podcast. I'm your host, Gazette Hawkeyes reporter John Steppe. I'm excited to be joined by the voice of the Hawkeyes, Gary Dolphin. Gary, thanks for joining me.
Hey, John. Good to be with you. Nice to see you here in the off season, of which we don't have much left.
Yes, ticking clock here till fall camp, till Big Ten Media Days, till all those things. So when we get to August 31st, you're going to have a new broadcast partner.
Yeah.
What was it like in terms of going through that process and getting to know Pat Angerer better?
First off, we had so many great candidates. All names, all names, great players at the University of Iowa. And unfortunately, we can only pick one. I know I said multiple times I could work with any of the guys. We ended up with 5 finalists. We originally had 10 guys on the list, 10 names on the list. And obviously, you're going to get, Iowa's unique, or Iowa City's unique in that geographically speaking, there aren't a lot of the candidates that live in Iowa City. So that's always been a prerequisite, that we have to have somebody who can get to Iowa City on game day or travel with the team on the road. And these 4 or 5 guys were willing to do that. And the other 5, most of them, they got kids going into junior high or high school. And as a parent, they don't want to miss their games. And there were some great names on that list. So in the end, one of my criteria was that Iowa's been so doggone good on defense forever, 25 years with Norm and now Phil Parker, that I thought it was important that if we could find the right guy, that if he's a former great defensive player, that would add to the spiciness. And of course, nobody played the game harder, better, with more ferocity than Pat Angerer. First team All-American at Iowa, great player both in Iowa City and obviously in the pros with the Indianapolis Colts for a number of years till injuries took its toll. And Pat also has a temperament, a vocabulary, a lot of the mannerisms that Ed Podolak has. And so I saw a lot of the same traits there. We had a committee of 3, 4, 5 guys that ultimately helped choose. And it was a very difficult decision to make, but I think we got it right in the end. And Pat, I've known Pat since his playing days. He's got a great sense of humor, yet he's such a caring human being. His hallmark is leading Brett Greenwood out of the tunnel that night after Brett, a few years ago, had suffered a debilitating stroke and some other health issues. To this day, Pat and his former teammates of Greenwood help him get around and maneuver not only to games but through everyday life. And so Pat's a very caring, very emotional guy, and I think that'll come across on the air as well.
And then kind of moving on from a broadcast partner that you've been with for a very long time, what is it that you're going to miss the most from Ed Podolak?
Well, it's his personality. I mean, his sense of humor. Ed, and I've said this often, he's the best I've ever worked with. And in 52 years, I've worked with a lot of good analysts, both football and basketball. And I always gloated that, as far as I know, I'm the only Division I play-by-play announcer. And there's only 130 football teams at the Division I level, or at the Power 5 level, John, as you know, and 330 basketball teams. As far as I know, I'm the only one that had a Super Bowl champion as a football analyst and an NBA champion as a basketball analyst, and both were great players at Iowa. Of course, Bobby Hansen is still with us and will be for a long time. And Ed's still going to be involved in the broadcast. He'll offer up his analysis, his pregame preview of that week's opponent, starting with Illinois State on the 31st of August. But Ed's 77. I mean, Father Time catches up with all of us, both physically and it wasn't that Ed was off his game, but physically, he's struggling. He played 10 years in the NFL, was in a horrific car pedestrian accident, as you know, 10, 12 years ago. And so that's starting to take a toll on him physically. And as you know, as the Big Ten expands, the travel becomes more difficult. I'm not complaining. I love the job, and I love going to all these great arenas, these great stadiums around the country. But my day's coming too in a few years. Health permissible, of course. And so it's good to have Ed still involved in the broadcast. To what degree, to what length, we're still working through that yet. But it'll be great to have both Ed and Pat Anger in the same day.
And then are there any kind of favorite moments? I'm sure it's hard to pick one considering how long you've worked with them, but is there one that really stands out?
Well, there are several, 27 years working with Ed. And of course, I knew him socially long before that, having done the games out of Dubuque years ago and covering Iowa through my television work of 10 years. When I traveled with the team, usually Ed, Zabel, Bob Brooks, Ron Gonder, we'd all have dinner. And so I knew Ed very well before we started together as broadcast partners. And what always struck me about him is his ability to describe the play uh, to where a sixth grader can understand what went on, or a chemistry major got it too. Because as you know, we have when you're listening to an Iowa football game, we've got the casual listener, we've got the passionate listener, we've got all levels of football knowledge. Eddie was the best, is the best I've ever worked with at relaying what happened to where everybody can understand it. The other unique thing about him is I'm never without binoculars. Now, my job is to follow the football, and I'm always looking at the quarterback first, and it branches out from there. Podolak never, ever used binoculars. Now, we're 8 stories up at Kinnick Stadium, and as you know, we go to Columbus or Ann Arbor. You're a lot further away than that from the playing field. And I asked Ed one time, I said, how do you not use binoculars? He said, I want to see the defense, buddy boy. I want to see what the defense is doing. And I can't do it if I'm pigeonholing on the linebacker or the defensive tackle. So that immediately took me back to his playing days when he was one of the great running backs in the NFL, with hands on kneecaps, and his eyes were always moving, he said, around that crossbar face mask. He always wanted to see where the linebackers were jumping, where the D-backs were shifting, and he transferred that to the broadcast booth, and it was just incredible. His analysis week in, week out. I've got a ton of great stories. If I write a book, they'll all be in there. But what amazed me about Podolak, and we'd have this conversation with Coach Ferentz or Coach Fry. We did the last 2 years of Hayden's regime, and we asked him, "Hey, look, if we're stinking the joint up, we're not going to kid the audience." And both coaches said, "Look, if we're playing bad, tell the listeners we're playing bad, but don't get personal," which we would never do that. Now, Ed will get after a position group if they're not playing well. I remember what game it was last year. I can't remember the game, but he said, "Buddy boy," he's talking about the offensive line and how poor in his mind they were playing. "Buddy boy, none of those guys could block me today. That's how bad they're playing." And I'm 77 years old or 76, whatever it was. So he'd come up with lines like that were just, and I'd hear from the listeners in the off season or text messages how they're laughing. They're still laughing over that Podolak comment. Probably my favorite story of Ed and his candor and his genuineness was, I don't know when it was 10 years ago, maybe. We were opening the season like a 4 touchdown favorite over Ball State. And it was a beautiful day. It was 75 degrees, Labor Day weekend, no humidity, not a cloud in the sky, sold out Kinnick Stadium. Everybody ramped up. Remember, Jake Rudock was the starting quarterback that year, and C.J. Beathard was about to emerge. But with, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes, I may have some of the facts off base here, but 5 minutes to go in the game, John, and Iowa's down 2 scores to Ball State. And they got one timeout left, and they're turning the ball over, and they're just not playing well on offense. And so Iowa, uh, as I remember, 3 and out, they punt the ball away to midfield, and there's an official's timeout on the field. And I quit quick because Ed's running his hands through his hair, and he's about ready to throw the headset down. And I quickly get to a break. This is Hawkeye football from Learfield. And he puts his head down on the counter, and he just left it. I thought he dozed off for a minute. And it's a 2-minute commercial timeout, and 7 or 8,000 fans got up and just headed to the exits. Clearly, they're going out to start their post-game tailgating. So we come back from the commercial timeout, and Eddie puts his headsets on. I go, well, buddy boy, I'm trying to make it a light moment. Buddy boy, we just saw something that we don't see every day here at Kinnick State. What's that, buddy boy? I go, well, 7,500 people just got up and left and going to start their tailgating early, given the fact the Hawks are down 2 scores with, at least in their mind, no hope of a comeback. He goes, don't kid yourself, buddy boy. If we weren't getting paid, we'd have been gone a long time ago. I mean, just threw that out there out of the blue. I got laughing. I finally got my composure back. The Hawks got a turnover, went down, got a quick score. They burned their final timeout. And what I remember is a Ball State running back angled to the near sideline and went out of bounds with like 50 seconds to go. I was out of timeouts, and so it stopped the clock and got the ball back and maneuvered down and kicked a field goal to win the game. So 2 things: you never give up, of course, but the Iowa defense performed admirably again that day. But that Podolak line was just a classic Ed Podolak moment. And there have been many of them, particularly in bowl games, where he gets a little more loose with the commentary as the day goes on, because there's no national championship at stake, at least for the most part. But that's just one of the great lines that Podolak threw out there. If we weren't getting paid, we'd have been gone a long time ago. He's probably right. But we can't leave the booth. So we've stuck it out through thick and thin for 27 years, and I'm happy to say that most of the memories are great ones. Obviously, everybody wants to talk about the Capital One Bowl. My favorite memory, though, where it really meant something, was the night game at Michigan State. The Hawks were, I think, 8-0 and ranked, I think, top 5 in the country, and down 4 or 5 points. They needed a touchdown, and Colin Sandeman had just been laid out and concussed by the Michigan State. I think it was a safety, and he was straddling him, standing over him. And I remember Adrian Claiborne, it might have been Anger, came in and 2-hand shoved the guy in the chest. Anyway, the flags were flying. Michigan State got hit with a unsportsmanlike, a personal foul, and then an unsportsmanlike penalty. So it was like 30 yards in penalties. So the Hawks are out of timeouts. Ricky Stanzi just puts the team on his shoulder blades and drives them 55 yards in like a minute and a half. And on 4th and goal from the 7-yard line, as Marvin McNutt would later explain, I told Ricky, throw me the ball, last play of the game. There's like 3 seconds to go. And Stanzi says, Marvin, you're going to be double teamed. You got a linebacker and there's a safety waiting for you at the goal. Throw me the ball. And Marvin had big hands, as you know, and real thick fingers. And Stanzi says, okay. So a quick 3-step drop, and he angles a short slant to Marvin, and he catches the ball, loses the linebacker, bangs into the safety, falls into the end zone for a touchdown, and the Hawks get to 9-0. And I think they were ranked 3rd the next week. Came home, and Northwestern, who had a really good team, upsets the Hawkeyes. Stanzi got tackled just outside our end zone, tore ligaments in his foot, and missed the remaining 3 games plus a month for bowl prep, but came back, if you remember, against Georgia Tech in the Orange Bowl, and just performed lights out. And the Hawkeyes defense, with Pat Anger in the middle, held a team that was averaging 330 yards with that triple option run offense, held Georgia Tech to 138 yards of total offense. That might be the most memorable game start to finish. But you think about that defense that Anger was on, John. They had A.J. Eads and I think Jeremiah Hunter at the linebackers, 3 great linebackers. Adrian Claiborne, who could play either side of the field, with Carl Klug and Mitch King and Broderick Benz up front. They absolutely terrorized quarterbacks. And then in the back end, you've got Tyler Sash and Brett Greenwood at the safeties. The cornerbacks were terrific. It was just another example of great Iowa defense. And they usually won the battle of special teams too. So those are some of the great memories that I take away, to at least to this point, from football. There are many others, but those are the ones that stick out.
You were mentioning the Capital One Bowl, not to ask you the thing that you probably get asked all the time, but what do you remember from that one, and how often do people bring that up to you now, almost 20 years later?
They bring it up a lot, and I'm disappointed to say that I was embarrassed by the finish of that game. Number one, I didn't know who caught the ball because I was still harping, as Podolak and I both were, about the fact that we weren't calling timeout. With 2 timeouts left and 15 seconds, I think, when they wound the clock after the Iowa penalty, uh, dummy me up in the press box thinking Drew Tate doesn't know how much time's left and why aren't we calling timeout, when he and Kenny O'Keefe had the thing figured out long before that. They had 2 plays called, as it turned out. And Clinton Solomon, who was our best wide receiver, had taken double coverage to the short side of the field. And Saban decided to, or the defensive coordinator decided to run a pure freshman in there as an extra defensive back. And his head was on a swivel. He had no idea who he was covering or where. And of course, he's supposed to be covering Warren Holloway in the slot. Eddie Hinkle was on the other side, the wide side, and Eddie, all Big Ten, had single coverage. So Drew takes the snap, and I blabbered out, the game's going to end on this play, and he pump fakes to Solomon. And of course, Clinton had all the double coverage, and Holloway runs right by this bewildered freshman, pump fakes, and he just pop flies it down the seam. And Hinkle gets a great block, a chip block, because that cornerback saw it right away. And he was circling to Holloway and probably would have had his arms around him at the 4 or 5 yard line. The game probably would have ended at the 5. And so Holloway barrels into the end zone with, 5 defenders on him, and then half the Iowa roster jumped on him in the end zone. And I caught up late, called touchdown Iowa, touchdown Iowa, touchdown Iowa. Didn't know who caught the ball. Thankfully, Rob Brooks was down on the. It's Holloway, Warren Holloway, the forgotten man. So I learned a valuable lesson there: is don't worry about what's going on down on the field other than the snap of the football. Call the play. You can always double back and worry about why they didn't call timeout. And I asked Kenny O'Keefe later after the game. He said, well, we had 2 plays called. And now keep in mind, Iowa only needed a field goal. So Eddie and I were a little bit justifiable in our frustration there. And Walner Belness had run the kickoff all the way out to about midfield, maybe just across midfield. All they needed was a field goal. And I think Schlicker might have been the kicker. I can't remember then. But we had a good field goal kicker. But that's immaterial. Kenny O'Keefe's the offensive coordinator. He knows what he's doing. He and Tate got together. Tate wanted to call that play. And as we all know, Drew Tate was a pretty smart guy. He got it done in big moments, including that game. So, and Podolak was speechless because tears were running down his face. I tried to throw it to him once. He couldn't talk. He was so emotional about it, which shows former great players at Iowa like Podolak still get emotional when their school colors, the black and gold, perform like they did. So it was a great moment. I don't want to overplay the stupidity on my part at the end of the game, but I get asked a lot about that if it's my favorite play or my favorite call, and certainly it's right up there. But I'd go back to the night game at Michigan State that really was the trampoline or the catalyst for what would become an 11-2 season for Iowa. And Stanzi with the American flag wrapped around him on the stage. I can't remember what was going on in 2010, but his great line was, "America, love it or leave it." And that's how we ended that broadcast that night down in Miami.
And then you were mentioning Ed's humor, and then, Pat obviously has his humor. Was that an appeal in terms of having somebody that, can bring that kind of humorous element to the booth?
100%. As you know, Iowa radio is so unique. It's so different than other schools around the Big Ten, really around college football. Most are in, major metropolitan areas. And, I grew up in this state listening to AM radio, WHO, WMT, KCRG radio at the time in Cedar Rapids with Bob Brooks, Gene Clausen. I can go on. The first year I covered Iowa football, John, was 1972 or 3. It was the 0-11 year. Let's put it that way. Dan McCarney was starting in the line. Bobby Elliott was a defensive back. I think Butch Caldwell was the quarterback. Frank Lauterbur was the coach, not for long. But FXL was relieved at the end of that year, and then Bob Cummings became the head coach. So that, that's 50, 51, 52 years ago. And I felt I'd come full circle in 2015 with the 12-0 team. And so that's another unique part about this broadcast career of mine. But to your original point, we're such an ag-based state. So many farmers listen to us out in the field all seasons, whether they're turning dirt or combining or picking corn, and we hear from them. Seems like we hear from all of them, all across the state, all across the Midwest, really. The Iowa signal is a great one. You know, WHO gets into 40 states at night, and a lot of our games are late afternoon, evening. There's XM satellite. It's so much different now than it was when I first started, even back in the 90s, when you didn't have all these outlets. So radio's a big deal in Iowa because we're a radio state. We've got two major interstates that intersect each other. A lot of people are listening, washing their cars in the driveway on their way to the supermarket, and we hear from a ton of them. You know, everybody still watches the games. Don't get me wrong, but I can't tell you how many people, despite the delays in signals, portal that they listen to the Iowa game on radio to get the local flavor, the local call, and watch it on TV, which is great. We got the numbers here a few weeks ago. We've got probably 500,000 people that tune in and out to an Iowa football game. As you know, we're all channel surfers, so we're bouncing around going to different stations, but we always come back to Iowa football on Saturday afternoon, and the number was right just below 500,000. Now that includes XM satellite. We had 185,000 viewers on the YouTube channel, the Hawkeye YouTube channel, or the Learfield YouTube channel. And all you see are Podolak and I in the booth. Now, why people are enamored with that, I don't know, but it is a different look. And so they can listen to the broadcast and watch it live. 185,000 people tuned in and out to our YouTube channel. So it's really humbling. It's a unique situation. And of course, when we travel around the state in the spring and early summer to the iClub banquets, you know, whether it's 700 people in Carroll or 300 in Des Moines or, you know, 150 people in Cedar Rapids or a couple hundred in the Quad Cities, we always get the same reaction. Love listening to you and Eddie on game day. And I think part of the draw is that not many stations, not many networks do a 2-hour pregame show. And so we get all these people driving to the stadium, and that's what they tell us, man. We jump in the car in the driveway in Omaha, and we get your entire pregame show as we're pulling. By the time we're pulling into the Kinnick Stadium parking lot, and the same way with basketball in the wintertime, it's an hour-long pregame show. But people are at home, you know, they're getting around the dinner table, and they got the radio on. So it's very humbling, very heartwarming. But Iowa fans are very loyal to their radio as much as they are their teams.
You were mentioning kind of the full circle nature of your first year covering them was the winless season. Then you see 12-0 in 2015. What's it like seeing this program in such a different state? You know, 2 of the last 3 years were 10-win seasons compared to when you were first covering this team.
Yeah, that was part of the you know, that early 70s, late 60s. Eddie, of course, played in the late 60s. Was part of the you know, much was made about 19 straight non-winning seasons. I think they had a couple 500 seasons in there. I always loved Jim Zabel's line. He goes, 19 non-winning seasons. Look, it's only two bad decades. Jim could always whittle it down to a smaller number. It's only 2 bad decades. But obviously, I love covering the Hawks. You know, the record's important, yes, but I love the game day atmosphere of then Iowa Stadium to Kinnick Stadium. Of course, nothing like Kinnick Stadium now. The way they've retooled and remodeled and refit the stadium and build it up and to the noise level now at you know, 70,000 strong. So it's so much different than in the early 70s when rarely were the Hawks on TV. That was the other thing. We knew the game was going to start at 1 o'clock or 1:30, no later than 1:30, because there were no lights and it started to get dark around 4:30. You don't have to worry about that now, obviously. But you know, across 50 years, you know, everything changed when Hayden got there in 78, 79. To think that he could take that program and have him in the Rose Bowl 3 years later is just mind-boggling to me. And of course, Hayden built it from there. And Kirk's got a little Hayden into him. I mean, in him, in that he kind of keeps everything to himself and makes notes all the time. And if you drew a line in the sand with Hayden, whether you're in the media or uh, or a fan, he didn't forget that. And Coach Ferentz is the same way. So it's to think we've had, John, two football coaches in uh, almost 50 years. That's incredible, and had a lot to do with Bump Elliott and then Bob Bowlesby after him, Gary Barta. The stability of the program since Hayden arrived is what really has stood out to me all these years. And I've covered Iowa for the most part. I was at Northwestern for 6 years in the early 90s. So, but I always followed Iowa at that time. And so I would say that the big thing is the stability. Bump, I've told people this. I remember when Bump hired Hayden, I interviewed Bump. I said, North Texas, SMU, John Hayden Fry, not really known in these parts. How did you settle on John Hayden Fry? He goes, he just struck me in his interview. Bump said he struck me that this guy was a throwback. He knows how to win. He's won everywhere he's been. He brought SMU into Columbus, Ohio, and played Ohio State off its feet when the Buckeyes were ranked #1 one year. That caught Bump's attention, and he thought, and I remember his last line. He said, "Dolph, let's put it this way: if I don't get it right with Hayden, he'll be leaving, and I'll be going out the door with him." And thankfully, Bump got it right because there was not a better human being on the face of this earth. When I remind people, Bump hired Lute Olson, Dan Gable, Hayden Fry, and he hired Christine Grant, who in turn hired Lisa Bluter. So that Bump's a Hall of Famer in many different vernaculars, especially as an athletic administrator, and the numbers show that. But I would think if I had to label Iowa football, it's just the stability of the program, thanks to John Hayden and to Kirk Ferentz.
And then if I'm doing my math right, 27 years for you as the exclusive voice of the Hawks, and this will be year number 28 coming up.
No, this will be year 27, I think.
Okay.
I think. Well, 1997 was the first year, John. So if we go to 2027, that's minus a couple. Yeah, 27.
Okay.
Number 27 coming up. Let's hope I get through 27. Okay.
So how much longer do you think you want to continue doing this?
Well, I just turned 73. I'm in pretty good health. And I'm certainly not going to do a one and done with Pat Anger. I couldn't do that to him. Eddie and I talked long and hard about both going out the door at 25, which was be 2 years ago. And we got to 25, and Ed had no intention of leaving. He had a rebirth of sorts. I said, well, okay. He said, in fact, his line was, I'm going to go another 25. I go, well, good for you, buddy boy. I won't be there at the end of the next 25, but I'm sure, that's just who he is, which I love about number 14. There aren't many guys, John, that have their number on the inner wall, the inner banner of a stadium. And Podolak's number 14's up there with Buck Buchanan and Len Dawson and Curly Culp and Willie Lanier down at Arrowhead. And so the guy is so special to me and to Iowa fans. But old father time catches up with all of us physically, and so if my health remains like it is now, I mean, I'm certainly not as fast as I used to be running to the bus, and the travel is the big thing with me. Football, I know I got one game coming up on Saturday. Well, actually two on Friday this year. Basketball is a little more draining physically. But I'd like to go another 2 or 3 years, and then get to then I'll be 75, and to me that's right now that's enough. Let's let the next voice of the Hawkeyes, he or she, come in and do their thing.
And what has made this such a fun job that you want to continue doing it, well into your 70s?
Well, I grew up in Cascade, which is 60 miles from Kinnick Stadium. And Carver, or the old Iowa Fieldhouse. My folks had season tickets. My first game in Iowa Stadium, I think I was 10 years old. Notre Dame was playing Iowa that day in football. Notre Dame won by a sizable margin. but I didn't care because that's when I fell in love with Iowa football. Actually, I grew up with a little red spin dial transistor RCA radio, and I could get Tate Cummins on Saturday at 1 o'clock from Kinnick or Columbus, wherever they happened to be. And then it was Paul Eels and Frank Caridio, and then eventually Ron Gonder and Zabel and my buddy Bob Brooks. And that's where I really was introduced to Iowa football and basketball. And I gloat when I tell people the first Iowa basketball game I saw live, I believe it was 1962, was Don Nelson's senior night. And I think he hung 37 on Wisconsin that night. And there was nothing like the old Iowa Fieldhouse. And I'm here to tell you, I love Carver. But, I think the fact that I grew up so close to Iowa City is what drew me passionately to the Hawks at a very early age. And then in high school, I knew I wasn't. I played sports. I knew I wasn't good enough to take it to the next level. But listening to all these great broadcasters, I thought, man, wouldn't that be fun to do? And so I decided to choose journalism as a vocation. Went to school 2 years in Minneapolis at Brown Institute of Radio and TV, and attended Loras College after that, and here we are. You know, we try to do a lot of good with the broadcast too. Great causes, whether it's Steppe Family Children's Hospital or the American Cancer Society or Hope Lodge. There's so many great causes. Camp Courageous. I try to intertwine public service and volunteerism with our broadcast each and every week. And so that's a passion of mine. You got to give back to the community. And I feel we do that a lot through our broadcast. In fact, I just formed a foundation. It's called the Gary Dolphin, if I may be allowed to put in a shameless plug.
Absolutely.
The Gary Dolphin Journalism Scholarship Foundation, where kids who want to go to college, as long as they have a journalism or a communications component to their studies, we want to give a scholarship. We want to give two away, one to a female, one to a male each year. And there'll be more information. We just rolled that out. There'll be more information coming out on that in the near future. Some type of a little legacy that I can leave behind for maybe the next voice of the Hawkeyes.
Well, Gary, thanks for joining me.
Hey, John. See you a lot on the road. Always fun visiting with you and the guys at the Gazette. Glad to be on with you this week.
Thank you. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Until next time, we will talk Hawks later.